What if I were to tell you that we could literally end chronic disease in 10 weeks? Would you believe me? Today, I'm bringing on Nina Teicholz, one of the most credible experts in this area. She is a best-selling author. She has her Ph.D. in nutrition and has been deeply involved in researching the dietary guidelines for over 2 decades. I think you're going to be thoroughly blown away at this interview. So Nina, RFK has this huge goal of getting rid of chronic disease. And you personally have studied this specific area of chronic disease and the dietary guidelines for roughly at least 20 years, probably longer than that. What, based on the most credible research, would you say is the solution to chronic disease?
I think there's no question that the strongest, most rigorous evidence to support disease reversal is with a ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet. And what we have is more than 100 clinical trials now, which there's no greater amount of clinical trial research except for on the Mediterranean diet, which does not have as good results. There are more than 100 clinical trials showing that with a ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet, that not only can we reverse type 2 diabetes in merely 10 weeks, but also hypertension, the vast majority of cardiovascular risk factors, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
10 weeks. I mean, an average doctor who's treating someone with type 2 diabetes, how many weeks are they treating diabetes for?
The reversal rate, where you reverse a type 2 diabetes diagnosis with standard of care, that's 0.1%.
Oh my gosh.
In clinical trials using a ketogenic diet, often with support from a mobile app, that reversal rate is more than 50%.
This is huge. I mean, this should be all over the place. It should be in the news. Doctors should be using it, but they're not really using it, are they?
I've been following this for the past 10 years, and I have not seen a single mainstream news article on the ability to reverse a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes using diet, natural means. You see an article every week, every day on Ozempic or the GLP-1s, right? That tells you that the media is really informed by the pharmaceutical companies, by which they're also funded.
People think type 2 diabetes is irreversible, but that is absolutely, positively not true. You can do it. There's credible studies. And when we talk about credible, we're talking about the type of studies that they've done and also the number of participants, right, and the length of time. It's not some little observational study.
The largest trial ever on type 2 diabetes reversal had 300 patients in it. The patients on average had been living with diabetes for 8.4 years, and the majority of them were on insulin. And even so, they reversed more than half of their patients' diabetes in 10 weeks.
Also, tell us about the reduction of insulin, their medication, in this trial.
Nearly 100% of the patients reduced some or all of their medications within a year. The patients come off so quickly off their medications. That's one of the reasons that people with diabetes are counseled to go on a ketogenic with medical supervision, not because it's dangerous, not because it has bad side effects, but because they need to come off their medication so quickly.
What is the general consensus of the medical profession's thoughts on the ketogenic diet?
Ever since Robert Atkins came out with his books in the early 1970s, there has been a real skepticism out there about the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And back then it was warranted because there were really no good rigorous studies on his approach, even though he had a drawer full of medical files. But now those studies have really been done, yet we still see the same bias, I would say bias against this diet. And that is for several reasons. One is that the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, they're funded in large part by insulin manufacturers and other drug companies. So they have direct conflicts of interest. Doctors themselves also have these conflicts of interest. All their careers, they've been told that low fat is the way to go. So those diets are really almost diametrically opposed. And it's very hard for the medical community to change its mind. The American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology have come after the ketogenic diet with virtually no evidence, just sort of media campaigns saying keto is dangerous, a keto-like diet is dangerous, based on In one case, virtually just a spoken presentation with no data and not even a published abstract. So I think it's fair to say there's something of a propaganda war going on against low-carb ketogenic.
I think you could be right. It could be onto something there. Remember someone putting something out, it was just ridiculous. The definition of keto-like diet, well, there might be some similarities, but it does not resemble the ketogenic diet, right? I can't remember what that diet was, but I like that. Keto-like diet.
That was the study that came out of British Columbia by a researcher who simply gave a presentation on her findings for which there was no abstract, for which there was no published anything. Her study had not even been registered in any way. And yet they interviewed her, they press released her presentation. They didn't do that for anything else coming out of their annual conference. Everything else was a legitimate published study. Why did they do that? Why do they want to amplify her findings? I mean, it's clickbait, but also that headline drives people away from choosing that option. If the American College of Cardiology is coming out and saying this diet is dangerous, people listen. And I think that is the objective behind that.
Or what specific foods does someone have to eat, or what do they have to do with their foods to achieve this state of ketosis, which is the fat burning?
You're eating ideally natural sources of those foods. So that's eggs, dairy, meat, fish, shellfish, very small amounts of starchy vegetables and low sugar fruits. It's a sustainable diet. And this is a key point. It's sustainable because fat and protein are what are satiating versus carbohydrates actually trigger hunger. They have done experiments where they try to force feed people to eat like a stack of pork chops, and people just can't do it. Like I'm full. I cannot eat another bite.
Let's say you try to go from one meal to the next and you're not tapping into your own fat, you could actually easily get hungry real fast.
Your fat stores are actually like granola bars that are strapped all over your body. And they're there for when you don't have anything to eat. So when glucose is absent, your body can access those fat stores. It's great. I'm sitting here and I haven't had lunch, and hopefully I'm now living off of the fat stores in my thighs. The moment that glucose enters into your bloodstream, your body, it's like a bank teller window just slapping down. You can no longer access your fat stores. Then you cannot access your own fat for energy.
The dietary guidelines, which you studied extensively, people are influenced by that dietary guideline. Is it quite extensive as far as where it goes?
The dietary guidelines are really the most powerful lever in the country on what Americans eat for several reasons. One is that by law, all federal food programs are required to follow the guidelines. So that includes the National School Lunch Program, infant children feeding programs, programs for the elderly, the military, which has an obesity problem equal to the general population, is required to teach the guidelines. Second, the guidelines are basically downloaded by health professionals as the gold standard. So even if you don't know about the guidelines, when you go to your doctor, nurse, nutritionist, dietitian, they are giving you the guidelines.
What is the problem with the dietary guidelines, and is there a little bit of conflict of interest involved?
I was an author on the first ever paper to systematically review all the conflicts of interest of the experts that are appointed to review the guidelines. In the last committee, we found that 95% of that 20-person committee had a tie to either food or pharma. Half the committee had 30 such ties or more. One person had 152 ties to food or pharma. So, I mean, there are clearly influences there that are, direct conflicts with the idea that people need healthy food.
And there's certain viewpoints out there that, we need to get the chemicals out of the junk food and this and that. But from your viewpoint and your experience working with the actual food itself, can we actually correct the chronic disease if we're just eliminating a food additive?
I think that could only be beneficial for us. There's no reason we should have such long lists of ingredients in our food products. However, food dyes taken out of Fruit Loops is Fruit Loops that aren't attractive, but still carry a huge load of starch with them, right? So that's carbohydrate. So that's not going to reverse disease. I don't know of any clinical trial studies that show that removing these ingredients will reverse chronic disease. Where we have the evidence is with a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet that can reverse disease. We have many clinical trials on that. We must go forward, as RFKJ has said himself, in a science-based way. The best quality studies, especially for population-wide guidelines that affect everybody.
So if, in other words, you're saying if I have regular Pop-Tarts and maybe organic Pop-Tarts,
right,
no food coloring, this is not going to correct my metabolic disease. I looked at the amount of sugar, starch, and seed oil. It's actually, there's more in here. People know about sugar, but you also have this starch, which is not necessarily listed on the label as starch. It's kind of hidden sugar, right?
Starch molecules are just sugar molecules holding hands. And the moment you eat them, they become sugar in your body. Even if that's a whole grain bread, even if that's a dark rye loaf, it becomes sugar the moment that you eat it. Unfortunately, there really are no good versus bad carbohydrates because they all become sugar in your body. But I think the ultra-processed food companies are completely on this. They're going to figure out a way to reduce their ingredient list, and they're going to say, see, we solved the problem, when in fact, the real data shows that we have to target this specific macronutrient, which is carbohydrates, which is driving these diseases.
Right, because you look at even potato chips, right? It has 0 sugars.
Oh, yeah. That's a real racket. The whole 0 sugar, no sugar added, that is meaningless.
What is the single most important thing that we could possibly do to rid chronic disease?
If we can get good food advice about what constitutes a diet that can reverse disease out to the American public, then we will be able to reverse chronic disease, and we will be able to do it quickly.
I mean, the study that you quoted is like 10 weeks. That's like a little more than 2 months. That's such a short period of time.
It's amazing. It's possible to reverse type 2 diabetes in the largest study that has ever been done. More than half the patients reverse their type 2 diabetes in just 10 weeks.
This is not about doing more research, right? I mean, we keep doing research and research and research, and people say, yeah, the evidence is not out yet, but there's already research done on this topic. We don't need to actually keep doing it, right? We have credible data, at least as a starting point.
I completely agree. We have enough research. We have multiple randomized controlled clinical trials showing that disease reversal is possible. And there is not a need for more research at this point, although more research is helpful and needed, but we can absolutely start based on the research that we have. Here we have actual intervention trials on real humans that shows how the body actually responds. Far better source of data, and we don't need to wait to act on it.
Out of all the tests that a doctor can do, yes, we have blood glucose test, right? We have A1C. Is there any other test that would be important for a medical doctor to test as something to catch as a preventative type test?
Testing your fasting insulin will allow you to identify your steadily worsening metabolic health literally decades earlier, before you get a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So it's critical that we test people, even kids, with fasting insulin levels to discover, have they embarked already on this worsening metabolic health journey? I mean, doctors should do that as a baseline test. It tells you much more than your fasting glucose. It tells you more than your lipids. That measurement would just be a fantastic thing to do.
You have these intelligent people, but they're just missing the obvious. But I think it's intentional the way people are taught, because it's just, there's not a lot of money in food therapy.
The medical curriculum has been largely informed by the thinking of pharmaceutical companies. And so, doctors are taught that basically you can try diet and lifestyle interventions, but they largely don't work. So there's a kind of fatigue about diet. I actually had one student tell me that they went up to their lecturer in medical school afterwards and said, "Hey, doc, do you know about the ketogenic diet?" And the professor said, "Well, I'm actually on a ketogenic diet myself, but I'm not allowed to teach it in the classroom."
Interesting.
I can't blame the doctors. They're not getting informed, and their experience is they tell their patients to go on a diet. The diet doesn't work. And so it's legitimate as a doctor to conclude, well, this kind of intervention just doesn't work. So I'll have to move on to the pills and whatever else I prescribe. So that's a rational response to telling your patients about basically a failed diet.
This is just fascinating information. And I am very adamant about, and you are too, about promoting this solution I'm like, how did you simplify this and organize in such a way that it's just very interesting. So I appreciate that. I'm going to put a link down below. For those of you that have not checked that out, definitely check it out because it's super valuable and it's very easy reading as well.
Thank you. I mean, we live in a time when there are just so few journalists investigating the politics, the corruption in nutrition. I wish there were more. I have virtually no colleagues. So every time I look into something and find just wild amounts of conflicts of interest and shoddy science, and I wish I weren't the only person reporting on this. So, yes, I mean, I would welcome any journalists out there who would like to join me. I mean, it's a very rich vein to investigate. And for anyone who signs up for my Substack, there's so many pieces there about, the bad science on meat and cancer and the conflicts of interest on that panel, the conflicts of interest at our most esteemed universities like at Harvard and Stanford in their nutrition departments. I mean, it is stunning.
The awareness is coming up, and things are going to change. And I think the future is bright in this area. So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.